Okay, hello everybody. We are here for the third episode of the Ecological Psychology Seminar Series with Jelle Bruineberg of Macquarie University. And we are very excited for the talk that he's about to present, Productive Pluralism, Three Strands of Ecological Psychology. So it should be a fun evening. And make sure to stick around for some Q&A at the end. So you can just put your questions in the chat as you can put them in at the end or even as you follow along. And we're looking forward to this. So Jelle, I will invite you to share your slides.
Thanks a lot, David. One moment. Can you see me full screen now?
Yes.
Okay, very good. Thanks a lot for the invitation to come and talk here tonight. Not sure where people are. So this is a completely new project that I've done together with Rutger van Dijk and Rob Withagen. So here's just for those who don't know them. Here's both Rutger and Rob in for them characteristic postures. And really the aim for today is to analyze some of the history of ecological psychology, roughly from the period 1980 to 2000. And we think this is a really interesting and dynamic kind of time that can help us well kind of situate some of the debates we're currently having within ecological psychology. Just let me get started. So the International Society for Ecological Psychology, ISEP, that some of you might know, was founded in 1981. And some of these early attendants described the society's meetings as, and this is Costello, inspiringly interdisciplinary, attracting misfits from many different subject areas. And Tim Ingold, who also actually was one of those attendants, recounts that the people were all kind of united against cognitivism. They were fiercely divided among themselves. Now, in the decades after, ecological psychology seems to have lost some of that pluralist spirit to the extent that Dennett in 2017 can claim that ecological psychology's what he calls a cult-like aura has been repelling many otherwise interested thinkers. And so on the one hand, these descriptions of the early meetings give the impression of like a merry troop of disciplinary outcasts in productive exchange with one another. And something happened, some kind of shift happened in the decades after. So I think that Dennett's assessment is at least in part the result of a particular kind of self-branding of ecological psychology, right? So you can find papers in literature saying ecological psychology, 6 principles, or 10 commandments for ecological psychology. And they're all kind of trying to articulate a kind of all or nothing approach to ecological psychology. So in other words, this version of ecological psychology presents itself as a kind of package deal, and the concepts one ought to employ, the explanatory scheme one needs to adhere to, and the philosophical views, they all need to kind of come together in one unified view of what ecological psychology is. And on the one hand, you might think that this package deal is a kind of, or was a necessary step in the development of ecological psychology, right? So Chimero writes in his book, it is surely no exaggeration to say that without Turvey, Shaw, and Mace's theoretical work, ecological psychology would have died on the vine because of high-profile attacks from establishment cognitive scientists. And most notably here is Fodor and Pilichin's kind of 1981 paper. But on the other hand, this package deal approach is also in a sense unfortunate. So it hid from view many other interesting and relevant strands of work within ecological psychology that actually has been going on throughout the whole time. And it also impeded a conversation with the fellow E's, so to say. So the kind of more embodied and active, embedded, extended kind of strands of cognition. And also the landscape of cognitive science isn't the same now as it is as it was in the early 80s, where really cognitivism was the dominant paradigm. So if anything to remember from this talk, that the central message here is that despite appearances to the contrary, the pluralist spirit of ecological psychology has never completely ceased. And through this work and through this talk, I hope to rekindle at least some of the misfit and renegade and pluralist spirit of early ecological psychology. One caveat to make here right from the beginning. What I'll do is focus roughly on development and work roughly in the period 1980 to 2000. Partly because this was a very dynamic time, but also because the current literature is much more diffuse and hybrid than the kind of approach we'll be sketching. So some of the recent literature here tries to find connections with intersectionality, with pragmatism, with enactivism, with critical theory, phenomenology, etc. So in a sense, these are not kind of tools to diagnose or to kind of think through the current literature, but perhaps the strands I'll identify can serve as kind of points of orientation to situate the current literature a little bit. So here's the outline of the talk for today. I'm going to start by introducing a few what I think are basic ingredients for any kind of ecological psychology, and then try to identify 3 distinct strands within ecological psychology that make use of these basic ingredients, but in quite radically different ways. And so the 3 strands I'll be presenting are, on the one hand, physical ecological psychology, which focuses primarily on discovering laws that govern perception and action and kind of models itself after physics. And for those familiar with the literature, this is mainly the kind of the Turvey school of ecological psychology. Second, there's a strand called biological ecological psychology, which focuses on applying evolutionary and selectionist principles to perception action cycles. And Reid is like a main proponent of this strand. And third, there is something called social ecological psychology, which focuses mainly on how the social permeates perception action cycles and kind of denies a primary distinction between the social and the physical as a starting point for psychology. Kostal and Heft are primary exponents of this view. And perhaps kind of setting apart these strands and showing in which way they differ can at least help to start a conversation within ecological psychology about strengths and weaknesses of each approaches, and perhaps can provide for a more productive kind of pluralist approach within ecological psychology. Okay, so let's start with the basic ingredients. So what is it that distinguishes ecological psychology from what may be called non-ecological psychology? And is automatically all non-ecological psychology cognitivist? And so perhaps the first pass at an answer is given by the slogan from Bill Mays: ask not what's inside of your head, but what your head is inside of. So ecological psychology is psychology that focuses first and foremost on the structure of the environment in which an animal lives, rather than the kind of structures that are inside an animal's head. And so consequently, we identified 3 basic ingredients, and the first of them is that animal and environment form an inseparable pair. So one implies the other, and vice versa. And so this inseparability makes that you don't have to posit all sorts of kind of computational structures inside the animal so as to kind of represent or somehow represent the external environment in the animal so that it can do things with it, but it starts from an inseparability. And as a consequence, perception then kind of stands in the service of maintaining a direct contact between an animal and its environment. And perception, third, is itself of affordances. So this gives rise to all sorts of perception action cycles that keep the animal in continuous coupling with its environment. And I think that roughly these are kind of basic ingredients that most, if not all, ecological psychologists can to a certain level of abstraction kind of agree with. And really the disagreement comes in how to answer a different set of questions. And these are a number of kind of basic questions. And for example, they hold what counts as an explanation and what is a good explanation. What is either implicitly or explicitly the ontology that is assumed, and what are the specific definitions and specifications of affordance and information in a particular strand of literature. So what I'll do is kind of introduce at a relatively abstract level the different strands in the literature, and then in each instance kind of have these questions as a checklist and seeing like, okay, what is the model of explanation that this strand is using? What is the ontology that is assumed? And what are the definitions of affordance and information that are at play? And the hope is that in this way, the kind of the pluralism of ecological psychology comes to the fore nicely, and that can, in that way, kind of a lot of crosstalk can be avoided. So the first strand I call physical ecological psychology, and as said already, the main exponent here is Mike Turvey and his collaborators, and perhaps the foundational text for this approach is the reply to Fordham and Pilichin, Ecological Laws of Perceiving and Acting, which is by Turvey, Shaw, Reid, and Mays. Reid will reappear as well in the biological strand, and in a sense, this is one of the last things that Reid did within this kind of more physicalist approach to ecological psychology. But especially Turvey, Shaw, and Mays have been kind of developing this trend over decades together with a lot of collaborators. And so the main starting point for this approach is that, and of course, this is somehow presented as the Gibsonian approach, and there's I don't want to get in the debate about which of these strands count as the true Gibsonian approach. But this approach promises to put psychology back on the track of seeking lawful relationships. So, and in that sense, it models itself, as said, after physics, which also, at least under a particular interpretation of physics, is seeking lawful relationships and lawful regularities. And the main commitment, I would say, of this approach is that there is a single set of strategies that nature applies with equanimity to each of our scales. And so the idea is here is not kind of a physicalism in the sense that everything reduces to one scale, namely the kind of the tiniest scale of the universe or so. There is some autonomy for each of the scales, but somehow the same principles, the same kind of laws apply at each of these scales. And then psychology, or ecological psychology, is looking at physics on the ecological scale, at the scale of perception and action. And what this approach then wants to do is focusing on discovering laws that govern perception and action. And one example here is the principle of maximum entropy production, which is rooted in thermodynamics and out of equilibrium thermodynamics, and basically wants to say ordered structure create entropy or dissipate entropy at a quicker rate than disordered structures. And so that gives kind of thermodynamic reasons for the emergence of things like perception action cycles. So cognition, perception, and action are grounded really in physical regularities that obtain at the ecological scale. And so this has consequences for how you think about affordances and information. So this is Turvey from a 1992 paper. I will sometimes kind of quote quite a bit, also just to kind of show that there is kind of textual evidence for these kind of approaches. In that sense, it's kind of a kind of philosophical project that we're doing. So in that sense, successful action requires what Turvey calls perspective control, the perception of what is possible. And the ways that possibility is spelled out is in terms of lawfulness. So here's Turvey. laws prescribe what can possibly occur, but not what must necessarily occur. For something to happen and to be really necessary, circumstances must be added to laws. Laws and circumstances, and he counts here, the circumstances are auxiliary conditions, boundary conditions, initial conditions, yield actual states of affairs, and real possibility, he says, is identical to lawfulness. So you have a set of abstract laws, but in order to really make predictions, to apply them in concrete cases, you need to kind of fill in those laws or complement these laws with what he calls circumstances. And what he calls real possibility then is in turn spelled out in dispositional terms. And dispositions are just kind of tendencies. So the classical example in philosophy is that salt has the disposition to dissolve in water. So anytime when salt is put in that particular context, namely in water, it has the tendency to dissolve if anything else implies. And so an affordance here is a particular kind of disposition, and one whose complement is a dispositional property of an organism. And these are also sometimes called affectivities. So here there's a kind of duality between properties on the one hand of the environment and properties of the organism. Just that you might think that salt has this disposition to dissolve in water, but water also has the complementary disposition to dissolve salt. And if the two are brought together, then something happens. But the way in which the kind of two dispositions come together is different than the way salt and water come together, because in many cases, the two don't come into physical contact. And so some kind of glue or so is necessary. And here, this is where information comes in. So information on this view is what links disposition and affectivity. So again, Turvey, a symmetry between a property of the environment and the perception of the property means since the property of the environment is what it is, then the information is what it is. And since the information is what it is, then the property of the environment perceived is what it is. So here there's a kind of symmetry between, on the one hand, the kind of property of the environment, for example, dispositions, affordances in the environment, and information available for perception. And because a lawful regularity obtains between the two, an animal can couple to the information and become, in that sense, coupled or informed about the properties of the environment and can act on the affordance. So these are, and the program here is to kind of introduce three of those views. So there's much more to be said about each of the views I'll be presenting. But this is at least in very abstract kind of terms, the main commitments, the main starting points of the physical approach. And let's just take a brief look about what are the commitments of this approach. So in terms of explanation, it should become clear now that the physical approach looks for general laws plus circumstances that prescribe or describe perception and action. And in philosophy, this is called the covering law model of explanation, looking for general laws that obtain in specific circumstances, or in all circumstances, but that make specific predictions given specific circumstances. And so the kind of ontological picture here is one of non-reductive physicalism. So physics is in a sense what describes nature, but there is a kind of independent level of description at different scales. And so there is the ecological scale doesn't reduce to something more basic, but has a kind of autonomy of itself. And so affordances here are very specifically dispositions that are complemented by affectivities on the side of the organism. And information is an ambient structure that lawfully specifies a property of the environment, at least to a point of observation and also to a perceiving animal. So at least I hope that this is kind of a clear picture of what physical ecological psychology is. And let's slowly move towards the second approach, which I call biological ecological psychology, which is mainly developed by Edward Reid, and his book Encountering the World is like a prime example of where this view is developed. And Reid has a different kind of starting point. So Reid's starting point is, and this is a quote, to show that the psychological is part of nature and therefore to be studied ecologically. Reid contrasts his approach with what he calls a kind of constructive view of psychology, where the kind of the aim and the realm of psychology is kind of some kind of mental realm that is different from the natural realm, where different kind of regularities and laws kind of apply. And so Reid distinguishes between what he calls regulation and construction. So the ecological psychology promoted here does not share this assumption, and that is the assumption of kind of having to build up the external world in your head so as psychology to start, and instead tries to understand how organisms make their ways in the world, not how the world is made inside organisms. So the question for psychology is how animals kind of are able to perceive and act and make their way in the world, and that does not necessarily require, or perhaps necessarily doesn't require kind of building up a kind of secondary picture of the world inside. And so the core idea is that animals regulate their encounters with the affordances of the information of the environment on the basis of ecological information. And in this regard, you might say that the kind of ecological information functions as an interesting kind of resource, and one that facilitates kind of opening up and opening towards affordances. So information isn't in itself kind of useful, but it's useful in the sense that it opens up the connection to affordance. And so Reid develops his approach, his kind of psychology based on what's called selectionist principles. And these are kind of variation, selection, and retention. And you might know this from a kind of biology a class or something, where variation are something like mutations that produce variations in the DNA. So now kind of this is the way it works in kind of selectionism in biology. Some of these variations have an effect on behavior, and they can outperform other variations. And if they outperform, then that kind of variation becomes retained in the genes. So here you have variation of genes, selection of particular set of genes, to what extent they kind of amplify or increase the fitness of an organism, and a kind of selective retention of those animals with a higher fitness, because they're the ones that get offspring and survive, etc. And so the basic picture here is provided by Reid. So he writes that the relatively persisting affordances of the environment, and similarly persisting information for those affordances, constitute the environmental basis of this selection process. And so Reid transports the kind of DNA and genetic kind of selection process to what he calls a neuronal selection process. And this is based on Gerald Edelman's neuronal group selection theory. And because affordances and the information for them tend to persist across many multiple populations of varying neural firings, it is these external factors that provide the selective shaping of neural functional systems. So the basic idea is we have nervous systems, and these nervous systems kind of come apart in perceptual systems and action systems, and they kind of start out in life as having lots of variation, in acting in the environment. Some of them lead to successful encounters with the environment, and other ones don't. There is some principle or mechanism for kind of selective retention in the agent, such that the ones that lead to kind of adaptive interaction with the environment will get fixed. And in this sense, kind of organisms become better and better adapted to their niche. And so what's really important here is that these kind of affordances and information are presented external to the agent, also kind of developmentally external. So as an evolving and as a developing animal, you can become better and better adapted and opening up to the existing affordances and information in the environment. So because they're constant and kind of relatively invariant at least over the timescales of development and evolution, affordance and information can provide a selection pressure for these neuronal functional systems. And so here there's a couple of things to note here again. So the kind of explanations here is a selectionist explanation. So the organism is what it is, the organism acts the way it acts because it has adapted to its niche by means of this process of variation, selection, and retention. So an organism becomes slowly better attuned to its niche, and that's the question is how this is possible. And so what's important here is that affordance and information are really presented as resources in the environment, independent of actual use. So if they would be dependent of actual use, they couldn't be this kind of ideal kind of selection pressure that the developing animal kind of works towards in opening up. Yeah, they couldn't be the kind of selection pressures that they are. And so here Reid becomes a bit tricky how he conceives of his ontology, because these affordance and information need to be real, they need to be independent of use, but still the kind of affordance and information that's there for a fox is different than the affordance and information that's there for a human. So it needs to be still relative to something, and he says it's relative to a population of animals. So it's a kind of delicate, perhaps a kind of relational realism where affordances and information are real out there in the environment, yet relative to a particular population, a group of animals. And then the third approach that I want to introduce is social ecological psychology, and perhaps this is the least unified of these these approaches. So I think the physical approach has been unified around one particular research program. The biological approach is perhaps unified because it's mainly kind of developed by Reid. And the social ecological approach take Alan Costel here and Harry Heft as two prime figures. But they don't necessarily kind of develop together one coherent research program, but kind of develop ways in which to bring the social dimensions of perception and action and ecological psychology to the fore. So this will be a slightly less kind of unified story. And so one canonical paper here is by Costel on socializing affordances. And Heft's book, Ecological Psychology in Context, is also really developing this view. And so what both Heft and Costel are doing can be summarized as socializing affordances, right? So Heft is stressing the social constitution of ecological psychology, and I'll explain in a bit what that means. And so the basic commitment here is that the social is not an add-on to a non-social form of perception and action, but permeates and transforms it in a way that you can never separate the two out. So here's Heft writing, one would be hard-pressed to find a place on Earth that does not bear the mark of human actions of both an intentional and an unintentional nature. And I guess to the extent that was true in 2007, it's even more true today. So the kind of starting point of much of ecological psychology, starting out with a natural environment, people like Heft and Costel want to kind of pressure that idea of kind of natural as independent of the social. And so I think this approach is and the kind of problems it brings up for ecological psychology and in ecological psychology is kind of nicely summarized by Heft in a bit of a lengthy quote. And Heft is writing about a slightly older technology, but I think you can fill in many kind of smartphones and etc. Things in its place. So Heft writes, can one justifiably say that a typewriter affords typing? If affordances are limited to body-scaled objects, which you might say it is in the physical approach, this claim makes little sense and may seem to be an unreasonable application of the affordance concept. Even though the design of a typewriter keyboard is scaled to the hand, so there's kind of a very physical relationship as well, the act of typing goes beyond mere manipulation of keys. It is a structured act both linguistically, and in terms of language expression, and motorically, in that a particular manipulation of the machine's part is critical. At the same time, when viewed as a structured act, typing can be seen as a goal-directed or intentional situated behavior. The act of typing is realized through the body in conjunction with the machine configured in a particular way. Within the domain of this situated act, the typewriter affords a specific action, namely typing. So I think there's a couple of things happening here in this quote. One is the question about technology and the way many aspects of our everyday environments are actually highly manufactured to fit us in a particular kind of way. But also the idea that what you encounter in perception and action is more than only an affordance that invites a particular kind of action, but these actions are always situated within behavior settings, within social practices, and they only make sense within that practice. So, and right, in a sense, a typewriter in the jungle without a practice of typing doesn't afford the kind of things it is affording. So it's not a physical relation that obtains between an animal or a human and a typewriter, but a relation that is socially mediated. And there's another element here as well, that in the sense that there is a kind of normative relationship that is kind of brought into the perception of affordances, and this is well captured by Kostel. So Kostel writes, so as such, affordances gain a canonical use which characterizes the normative character of the meaning of things. A chair, for example, is for sitting on, even though it may be used in many other ways, as firewood or for standing upon. The meaning of a chair is defined by its name, sustained and revealed within certain practices and realized in its very construction. So here again, the fact that there are chairs, that they are placed in particular kind of locations. I guess if people are listening, most of them will be sitting on a chair, perhaps behind a desk or whatever. That mediates and changes the affordance relationship and what a particular kind of object affords. So what a particular object affords is not necessarily kind of a given of the object itself, but only becomes revealed within certain practices and realized through those practices. Here we have still a kind of rather different picture. So the explanations here are not lawful and are not selectionist, but they are historical. So it is a history, and this is a history of interactions that an agent or an animal has had with its environment and particular practices. They make ambient patterns informative. So it's not that this information is out there independent of anything, but the significance and information is something that is constituted, that is made through these practices and through this history. So if you want to know what an agent will be doing when confronted with a particular kind of environment, you need to take this history and these practices into account. Otherwise, basically, there's no way there's no fact of the matter in the concrete situation that explains what a particular animal is going to do. And so this has implications as well for the kind of concepts that are at play. So affordance and information here are permeable to normative and social cultural concerns in a way that the biological and the physical approaches do not leave room for. And the existence of these of suitability for chairs so is not something that's kind of given with the chair or given with the relation between an animal with a particular leg size and so, but is relative to a particular kind of practice of sitting, of making chairs, of coming together, etc. And so the ontology here is one that might be called a kind of social constitution. It's so, and this is Costel, and I think this is a really nice quote, and he says, ontology includes us. Humanized nature is part of what nature has become. So if anything, humans have transformed nature. It doesn't mean that the social is now kind of a different domain from the natural, but the social is a transformation of the natural into what he calls a humanized nature. So here again, the idea is that the affordances that we encounter in our environment are not kind of raw objects that are just lying around, but themselves kind of made and sustained by acts of other animals and humans. And this is specifically true in our kind of highly technical environments that we are kind of currently meeting in. So I hope to at least have kind of sketched the three directions and really show how they're different. And so the next aim is to start a conversation between these two strands. And what we want to do in the paper, so currently Lutger, Rob, and me are writing this up in the form of a paper. We plan to look at published work in which these authors kind of converse with each other on these topics, and actually it's sometimes kind of hard to find. So there's a lot of kind of, I guess, kind of ignoring of the other kind of positions, and mainly kind of combating and relating to people outside of ecological psychology. But some of the topics include the social as a kind of, is it a kind of add-on to something, some physical process, or to what extent does it permeate perception, action, and can you not really make a distinction between the physical and the social? How do you think about selection? How do you think about normativity? Another big issue is the role of Darwinism. So if you take the physical approach really seriously, then the kind of the reasons why a perception action cycle obtain are continuous with the reasons why any pattern formation in nature occurs. And there's nothing specific about life or living processes in which a new kind of selection occurs. So reasons for purposive action and so are already given at the scale of physics, rather than you need something like a separate domain of biology for this. So what I at least have to hope to make clear that there are basically a couple of or three different kind of starting packs available within ecological psychology, which each model themselves after different sciences, so physics, biology, and the social sciences, and use different explanatory styles, concepts, and ontologies. So I just, not sure if this works well, but kind of try to summarize all this in like one table. So on top we have the three approaches that I presented: the physical, the biological, and the social, and kind of then the three questions that we asked each of them. What is the style of explanation? What is the ontology? And what are the concepts of affordance and information? And so the explanations are, on the one hand, the covering law model, a selectionist model, and a historical model. And ontologically, these can be understood as a kind of non-reductive form of physicalism. For the biological approach, kind of relational realism, or realism relative to a population. And for the social approach, really kind of social constitution approach. And therefore, kind of in line with these approaches, they also operate with very different notions of affordance and information. So on the physical approach, both are understood in terms of laws and dispositions. On the biological approach, they're kind of existing constraints in the environment, acting as selection pressures for the developmental and evolutionary process of animals. And in the social approach, they become again something different, in which they become themselves the result of practices and permeable to normative and sociocultural considerations. Now, so I think this theoretical diversity itself is a strength rather than a weakness, right? So in you might think that ecological psychologists need to find unification, so to kind of present a coherent picture to the outside world or so. But I think actually there is a possibility here for something really promising. So Tony Chimero, in a couple of papers with Reid, among others, made a plea for pluralism in cognitive sciences, partly to make room for what he calls dynamical explanations, and you might say as well ecological psychology, and perhaps a plea here to extend this pluralism not only to cognitive science but also to within ecological psychology. So in a sense, there's no very good reason for unification. There is so many different phenomena that fall under the header of what ecological psychologists are interested in, that there's very little chances to kind of keep that breadth of interest and at the same time try to find one unifying framework that captures all these kind of cases. And perhaps the kind of the shared ancestry in James Gibson's work can facilitate a productive exchange within those between those strands. So in many debates in cognitive science, people have such radically diverse starting points that a kind of productive conversation becomes difficult anyway. But here at least there is kind of a couple of texts that people take inspiration from and go back to. So in that sense, kind of this shared vocabulary, people all use information, people all use affordances, is both a bug and a feature, right? So it's a bug in the sense that it's very easy to talk past each other because we use the same terminology, but mean something entirely different. But I hope that at least this kind of the presentation of the different strands made clear that people have very good reasons, or might at least have very good reasons, to mean different things with the same concepts, and debates about what affordances are, whether they're lawful, whether they're relational, to what extent they're relational. I think they only make sense within these bigger debates about what are the strands, what strands are you operating in, what are your explanatory questions, what are your ontological commitments, and then you can have interesting debates about what affordances are and what information is. And so hopefully then there's a lot happening at the moment in ecological psychology, and as I was saying, the kind of the current literature in a sense is very diffuse in the sense that it's kind of looking for collaborations with an activism and different strands of the sciences and humanities. And so hopefully these kind of three strands can be a kind of point of orientation for both insiders and those otherwise interested outsiders that then it talks about to kind of navigate and productively interact with ecological psychology. So that was it. Thank you.
Okay, Jelle, thank you. That was fantastic. Really riveting talk. And I think a very, very good treatment of all three of those strands. I won't speak for the people within those strands, but from my reading of those texts, I think you did a really good job presenting them. So yeah, maybe I will fire away with the first question. So you mentioned these three different kind of flavors of ontology within the three strands. What do you think, if we're to accept these kind of three strands, are maybe kind of the meta level ontological implications that we do have these three different strands?
Yeah, so I'm thinking about this a little bit in the sense like, so what there's not kind of like one ontologically coherent picture of the world that and then you can have like different ways of asking questions or so, right? But in the sense, the pluralism is a bit more radical. That you say like, look, what the way nature is carved up is actually rather different for these kind of physical approaches, the biological approaches, and the social approaches. Sorry. So one operates with a strong distinction between the physical and the social, and one kind of completely gives up on that distinction, and that's implications for the way your ontology looks like. And so in that sense, it's a different style or a different brand of pluralism, perhaps than others have been talking about.
Fascinating. And do you think for the social, the third social ecological psychology, how would you describe the relationship, commitment, lack thereof, to realism, which is obviously a loaded term, but
yes, so I'm not sure, perhaps Lutger van Dijk is listening in, I'm not quite sure, but we've been having loads of discussions about about this question. And so, look, if you think of realism as there being a completely independent, finished world, kind of lying outside of yourself, ready to be discovered, then I think the social view is kind of resist that version of realism. But I guess if the version of realism is just like, well, reality is perhaps mind independent, but it's not independent of the things that you're doing, right? So it's still the case that the kind of environment that we have here needs to be regenerated, needs to be kind of maintained at all times. And so it's a kind of performative realism in which the real features of the environment are all the time the result of our own practices and our own doing. Then if that's a kind of realism, then I think that style of realism is compatible with this more social approach. But then it's kind of realism that always takes this that never escapes from this kind of practices and social settings in which things unfold. So there's this, just see if I have it here, but a book by Dreyfus and Taylor on exactly on this question. It's called Retrieving Realism, and it really wants to say, look, so if our access to the world is embodied, situated, socially permeated, right? What does it do for questions about realism? And their point is that, well, both for kind of ethical reasons and perhaps for descriptive reasons, you want to stick to at least some form of realism, and perhaps that approach doesn't work completely as it should, but I think there is definitely a kind of some route available for a kind of practice dependent realism, or a kind of more or less robust realism in the social approach.
Excellent. And one question that I've heard thrown around, so I thought I'd maybe give you a chance to answer, is when people speak about empirical research, how do you characterize the relationship of the three strands, maybe to doing empirical research, and maybe that taking different forms?
Yeah, of course. Thanks. Yeah, of course. One question is what you mean with the term empirical, right? So one reason why Kostel, for example, doesn't like the kind of this approach to lawfulness or so is because basically then you lock yourself into the laboratory, right? So and in a sense that's also sometimes the way this kind of physical approach is presented, like, we're doing the real empirical work, but it is mainly a kind of lab-based work, which of course is completely fine, but not the only kind of empirical work that there is. So the kind of empirical methodology that you employ in each of those strands would be rather different, I'd say. And so, I mean, for the physical approach, you can just point to the kind of just creative amount of kind of experiments, and so with very precise notions of information, and looking exactly what kind of what specification relationship is obtaining in highly idealized situations. So I think that's a very flourishing strand of research. And then in the social domain, the kind of empirical work would be different. So I know Heft has some work on behavior settings and observability of behavior settings with the kind of point light displays, and so that's fascinating work. But I know other people, try to see how more ethnographic approaches and so fit in there. And I guess the biological approach, in a sense, is a bit difficult. Because I'm not quite sure about kind of experiments that were done like towards the 90s. So Reid has some work like on the zone of proximal development and so that has a bit in like so I guess some of the lots of the work in kind of developmental ecological psychology I think would fit rather well with this kind of more biological approach. And in I've been trying to make the case that some of the work, at least in contemporary kind of predictive processing, fits well with the kind of ecological selectionist approach that Reid is specifying, or at least that approach, that predictive processing approach, would do really well to take Reid's lessons to heart. That what ultimately matters for a selectionist approach to neuroscience is not so much how well you're able to kind of categorize things in the environment or how well you're able to kind of represent things, but really how well you're able to open up to the affordances in the environment. And so their empirical work would be a little bit more kind of in the form of computational modeling, or at least mathematical modeling, and so. So I think each of them have something to say to them for them, and each of them have their own kind of set of empirical work that speaks in their favor.
Excellent. Okay, we have a question from James. James says, this was really great, thank you. I'm wondering how much the different strands could in principle inform one another. Could social affordances be explained by physical laws?
Yeah, that's great. Yeah. So I guess there's a couple of different kind of relationships there, right? So I think informing is definitely possible, and at least that's the kind of assumption through which we've been writing this paper. But if you want to talk about kind of the social being explained by physical laws, then you have a different kind of relationship, namely a more reductive kind of relationship. And so I think if you would ask people like Kostel and Heft, then the idea would be that, well, the physical couldn't explain the social unless you also kind of socialize the physical already, right? So I think this is in a sense the kind of dilemma that if you really start from a kind of lawful physical approach, this is also something that Chimero highlights, then questions about normativity or so, and which seem to be integral to kind of talking about social relationships, will never get into the picture, because just normativity doesn't obtain at the physical level. So I think the complementarity or the information can be more like, okay, specify to a different strand, like what is missing here and what is missing there, and what is part of my theory and what is not part of my theory, and how to possibly complement it. So I guess for this kind of exchange to really be productive, the kind of imperialistic kind of wanted to take it all kind of approach perhaps needs to be sidestepped a little bit, and the limitations of each of those approaches need to be acknowledged.
Excellent. Okay, Jonathan is asking, do you see any additional or distinct strands of ecological psychology emerging more recently?
Oh, great. Yeah. I think so. So one thing I haven't really mentioned, and Lutger and Rob, we've been debating this a little bit as well, is where and how to situate Eleanor Gibson's kind of developmental ecological psychology. And in a sense, I think there's a lot of overlap between both the biological and the social, so it sits somewhere in between there. Yeah, like more recently, in a sense, I guess there's a lot more hybrid approaches, right? So I guess I've been working in Amsterdam for a long time with Rietveld and Kivestein, and I guess that approach would be mainly situated also somewhere in between the social and the biological, and then perhaps a bit more social in the works also with Ludger van Dijk and so, and perhaps a bit more on the biological side in my work also on we're trying to relate ecological psychology with predictive processing. And like someone like Chimero in radical embodied cognitive science, he very much, I guess, takes the physical approach as his kind of conversation partner, and also kind of his promotion of dynamical explanations as a kind of covering law explanations in psychology, I think really point in that direction as well. But then he's also in a way trying to integrate these social dimensions in it. So he would be, I guess, someone who's a little bit more on the kind of physical social axis. So I don't really see a lot of kind of new approaches emerging, but way more kind of hybrids emerging. And so I think this is also what I meant when I was saying that perhaps these three strands can serve as a point of orientation for new approaches yeah, by having these three in play, you can really see what's new, but also what's kind of already kind of, yeah, taken up in these older approaches. So yeah, it can help you orient a little bit in the current literature, and also hopefully kind of prevent crosstalk a little bit, just talking past each other.
One thing that's come into my mind is remembering when you said, I think that the explanatory mode of the social strand tends to be historical. How do you see that relating to questions of scale of events or structures? You know, in the kind of the famous debates that we get into with the post box or the beer can, they seem to be kind of questions of scale. You know, at what scale maybe people are acting and perceiving at, whether that includes, you know, the more historical and social scale of, you know, in which the post box and the delivery system is, or, you know, the beer was filled and all that, or a more maybe a finer temporal scale of, you know, a certain movement being afforded.
No, yeah, I think that's a really important question, and I'm not quite sure what to think of it, right? So in a sense, the classical ecological approach is like, okay, here's your visual information. You can perhaps waggle about a little bit or walk around a little bit, but that's basically this is your current perceptual environment. And affordances are specified by the information that is in your current perceptual environment. And that's a kind of temporal closeness where there's like one scale, perhaps a matter of seconds, 10 seconds or so, but that's roughly about it. And of course, if you want to include history in that, you might want to say, well, we have just a kind of a set of knowledge about the way typewriters and post boxes and beer cans kind of are filled. So that knowledge influences the way we perceive the world. I think that's typically not the way you want to go in ecological psychology. But then the question is like, so how do you account for that history? And indeed, one way to do that is to kind of blow up or kind of expand that notion of perception a little bit, in the sense that what you're perceiving is not only kind of the information specified physically here and now, but also kind of the reference to these practices, and perhaps you perceive these settings. I mean, have to work that you can perceive behavior settings, I think, is also already kind of one scale up from kind of perceiving only kind of post boxes and beer cans, etc. But then, I mean, the cost of this, I guess, is that your notion of perception becomes less and less intuitive, because it becomes a way more historical notion of perception, where you can start to perceive the past or past events or practices that are distal also. Yeah, so that's a kind of conundrum that I think, yeah, that I'm still kind of grappling with a little bit.
I think personally, maybe lay some of the blame with Gibson. I think he sometimes gives the impression of bringing everything under one roof, and other times maybe parceling it a little bit. I sometimes see different maybe moods in in different areas.
Nice. Yeah. And that's in a sense also I mean, that's perhaps on the kind of meta level also the kind of fascinating thing about this whole approach, right? Is where they kind of, in a sense, these three strands are quite radically different, right? If you look at kind of philosophical commitments and so, like they just occupy different worldviews, but still all to some extent kind of base themselves on the same set of texts. Yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
I was going to say, would you say that with the skilled intentionality framework that you're sort of aiming at this tendency that we kind of move throughout these scales quite fluidly?
I think so. Yeah, I think in a sense that's the approach, and in that sense, doing this project also kind of helped me a little bit. I mean, so I just I intellectually just grew up in this kind of skilled intentionality way of thinking. Only later on to recognize that there were actually people who were thinking very differently about affordances and kind of these different kind of things. And I think now, having kind of studied these different strands, I think it is indeed a way of kind of integrating the social and the biological, but also kind of enriching our perceptual relationships with the world, both with the notion of solicitation, so it's not just kind of possibility for action, but also agency starts to come into play, invitations for action, and trying to account for at least a basic level of social normativity related to kind of like the forms of life and the kind of directed discontent that we can feel when something is not going right, or when we do something wrong, or when somebody else does something wrong. That at least a kind of basic form of normativity is there in our perceptual relationship with the world. And then the question is, and this is kind of work that's currently being done in Amsterdam, kind of how to scale up and how to go further and how to think about language, etc. This is I never kind of got into those questions, but I think indeed these kind of scales take social settings seriously, take practices seriously, and somehow in the here and now moment of perceiving the environment, all these scales play a role, and that's both. That's at least what we're trying to account for with this skilled intentionality framework, I think.
Excellent. Okay. This has been fantastic. And it looks like, unless we have any last minute questions, this has been really a treat. And we'd like to thank you again for coming on.
Thanks a lot. This was, I really enjoyed this, and great questions.
Excellent. Okay. And the stream will be posted on YouTube shortly.